Just what if, instead of rebooting everything with the DC Universe and James Gunn and Peter Safran overseeing everything, what if DC and WB decided to stick with the Snyderverse and produce Black Adam sequels, Aquaman sequels, a Man of Steel 2, and potentially even bring Zack Snyder back? That's what we're going to tackle in this video. Okay, so there's a couple of rules I need to lay down for how this works. We are picking up with the release of Black Adam. And what we are removing is James Gunn and Peter Safran. They are not a factor in. What's happening is that we're in a world where they never formed DC Studios. But what happens is David Zaslav continues the trek to fully commit to the DCEU and everything that was in development. And some of this will have to factor into the fans and what was reportedly being discussed behind scenes by higher-ups. So we're now in a position where the ending of Black Adam clearly establishes that Superman will go toe-to-toe with Black Adam in some film down the road. Now, this is important because we're definitely coming back to this in a major way. And the rest of the release schedule follows through pretty much the same way it did. Shazam is released, and without knowing that this would be the end films for the entire universe, the box office, in my opinion, would have been a little bit better. The film made $134 million worldwide. I think had they not announced that the universe is dying, this film could have pushed through to at least $175 to $200 million. Not a success because, well, let's be real, it wasn't gonna be a success. And with a budget of $125 million, it still would have been a failure, but just not as big a one. Enough that the character will come back, just not in a sequel. We then jump to that summer where we get the release of The Flash. Most of the film plays out pretty much exactly the same. But you gotta remember, the old plan is in motion. AKA the ending scene, which of course in the final cut includes George Clooney's Batman as the new Batman of this universe. It is, as intended, Michael Keaton's Batman, who's now the new Batman. Now, the film in its entire box office run made $271 million. I think it could have pushed to about $350 had, again, it not been made explicitly clear that nothing is happening with this character going forward, and if they revealed that Keaton was in fact this universe's Batman. Because this factors into the fact that Batgirl was not canceled in this timeline. This film was set to release in a hybrid HBO and theatrical limited release. It was made for $90 million complete. The idea was to pick up right after the events of The Flash and establish the new DC universe through the point of view of the new Batman, Michael Keaton, and of course, Batgirl. The film, I say, would have made maybe $100 million tops, but again, it's a hybrid release and it's here for a specific reason. With a budget of $104 million, making $130 in its box office run, I think Blue Beetle would have fared a lot better. People knowing that it's a new universe, this film getting great traction, I don't think it would have been a massive billion-dollar hit, but I could see this going up there in around 175 to 200 million. And being critically and, of course, commercially just received well enough that the action figures and merchandise and everything made it break even. Of course, digital and Blu-ray sales and all that would have helped. This would have been a hit. And then, of course, we got to end everything we knew was coming with Aquaman 2, aka Aquaman The Lost Kingdom. With a budget of $215 million, it managed to make $439 million. I think had everything still played out and everybody knew everything was in continuity, Michael Keaton's Batman shows up, this film, I think, could have been a successful $475 to $500 million. Thus, Aquaman 3 would have happened. But now this is where we get into the section that's more or less like fantasy booking. So if you guys remember, Charlize Theron was announced to be executive producing a DCEU series spinning off of Aquaman based on Aqualad. We don't really have the full details on which version of Aqualad, maybe it could have been both, but I think this series would have happened as a limited series. It would have been cheaper, like a high-end CW series like Superman and Lois, but I think it happens, and, well, you get one and done. I also assumed that series would have set up Black Manta as the father of Aqualad, and this would have brought us into the Trench film, a low-budget horror film at the bottom of the ocean featuring the Trench creatures. Next up, as it was about to start production before being shut down, the Green Lantern TV series, which was supposed to be way more high-budget and Green Lantern than what we're getting from James Gunn and Peter Safran, would have definitely hit. That would have been something that could have been make it or break it. But at the same time that this was hitting, we also know that DC was in production and already had lined up at least 6 different directors for the first 6 episodes of Adam Strange's Strange Adventures, an anthology series that opens up and bookends with Adam Strange, but also we know one episode was a live-action interpretation of Bizarro in the DCEU, directed by the one and only Kevin Smith. He confirmed that this series was canceled when DC Studios was formed. Now, while we don't got full details on what's going on, it's pretty much unanimously believed that Man of Steel 2 would have been the Man of Steel versus Black Adam. And this would have been like a giant confrontation where more or less nobody wins. They're kind of evenly powered. And Henry Cavill would have been back, of course, to star as Superman fighting The Rock, because this was just step one of the bigger picture of building out Black Adam as the ultimate bad guy. Because we know Zack Snyder was being considered to be brought back by somebody higher ups to continue working on the Snyderverse. And they were positioning Black Adam as sort of a stopgap in the DC universe to fight the Justice League before we got to Justice League 3, aka The New Gods. And in case you forgot, The New Gods was a film that was announced and in development, being worked on by Ava DuVernay. Ultimately, it was also scrapped when everything came crumbling down. Despite the disaster that was Wonder Woman 2, a third film was still going to happen, and it was only James Gunn and Safran that put a stop to it. So a third Wonder Woman that sounds like it would have been modern day was literally set to go, but that was canceled. I think this film would have come out. It would have done better than the second one, not as good as the first, still would have been a bomb. And even with all that in mind, we know that even Zack Snyder's goal was for Justice League 3 to essentially be set up for the ultimate reboot, and Crisis on Infinite Earths was a project in development. They've all confirmed this. That was the end goal. It would have been at the point of more or less no return. We can't keep this universe going. We realize we screwed up from the beginning. We're now setting up the reboot. This would have been the big blow-off of everything. And by all accounts, it would have only been a handful of years after Black Adam. So everything we just talked about would have come out in about the span of, well, ending right around now, if you really think about it. The box office for this, I think, would have been interesting. I could see $1 billion because they would have thrown money at everybody and anybody to be in it. But ultimately, it's a film that would only exist to freshly reboot everything and get everything streamlined under one roof. And the point I'm trying to make here is, even if the Snyderverse and the DCEU continued, they always had an endpoint in sight. And with the diminishing box office and reception, they went the correct route. Because if you look at everything I just said, everything would have been diminishing returns to a final blow-off that would have ultimately been a death blow to the entire universe as intended, you know? So, yeah, I think they really just made the right choice, if I could be real with you. And ultimately, what we could have had, I don't think is better than what we have now. There are a ton of possibilities and a ton of things that Marvel and Sony could have done with the Venom franchise. In this video, we are going to look at the potential impact that the Amazing Spider-Man could have had on the Venom franchise if he was added into it. So, as I think most of you know, the entire production of Venom was covered in reports that a Spider Man would appear in every film, from Venom 1 to the second one to, of course, the third one. And this jumped around between what Spider Man would appear. Originally, everybody was convinced it would have been Tom Holland. And then that was kind of confirmed in the second film, although that was a multiverse thing leading into Spider-Man No Way Home. And ultimately, we ended up getting no Spider-Man in the Venom franchise. Now, for this entry in What If and The Crisis, we are looking at the bigger picture here related to what if they decided to establish that the Amazing Spider-Man did take place in the Venom franchise, and that Andrew Garfield was a part of that universe. So for all intents and purposes, we're going to go to Venom 1. So the first Venom film plays out pretty much one-to-one, almost exactly the same. I mean, like, almost exactly. Like, we're talking 95% the same. But during the course of the film, where Eddie Brock is talking about living in New York and what happened, he reveals that his life took a really bad turn when he got working at the Daily Bugle, and this one reporter, who he mentions as Peter Parker, stood in his way. He got the scoops before him, and while he was working on a Spider-Man case, everything went south. He says he tried to expose Spider-Man for what he did, but Spider-Man made a fool of him. He lost everything, and the only thing he could possibly do was leave New York. He establishes he's still upset with Peter. He wants revenge. Now, Venom in this first film is still largely a hero as he's fighting for himself and to try to save himself, but being attached to Eddie fundamentally changes him, and Eddie's a lot angrier due to the Peter Parker connection, right? At the end of the film, this is where, like, the 5% change happens. Eddie, after defeating Riot, flies back to New York. The last thing we see is him going to the Daily Bugle, entering, and asking for Peter Parker. Jameson tells him he's not here. He asks if he knows where he is. Jameson tells him he hasn't seen him in a bit. He's not really sure what's going on with Peter. Something happened. So we establish that Venom takes place about 3 to 4 years after the events of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. After losing Gwen and that ending, Spider-Man abandoned being Spider-Man for about 1.5 to 2 years. He let the city kind of go to crap. He then came back, and as he mentions in No Way Home, and this is important because it's coming out after the first Venom film is out, he revealed he stopped pulling punches. That's why nobody's seen him. That's why he hasn't been active. He's kind of just kept to himself. He almost ended up completely killing one of his villains. Now, fully knowing this and this being established to us, because, hey, you know, he didn't hold back. That's what he says in No Way Home. After he's back in that film, we enter Venom 2, Let There Be Carnage. This time, for all intents and purposes, let's say the film remains mostly the same, just set in New York. That's an important factor here. But this time, we got to deal with Spider-Man as well. He's not going to be in the picture the entire time, but he will, as this film is sort of marketed in a different way. They market it on the Carnage factor and Spider-Man being in it. We just don't know to what degree. We then get to the point where, oh wait, Venom 2 is actually Venom versus Spider-Man. Carnage is just kind of a stopgap, right? It's almost like a triple threat match. None of these factions like each other. Neither of the three like each other, right? Spider-Man Peter is forced to put the mask back on and get back to it because of a symbiote outbreak in New York. He feels like he needs to do it. And after seeing the events of Spider-Man No Way Home, he now feels like he can be the hero that the universe and the world deserves. And he's going to put a stop to both of these symbiotes. So yeah, it's a drag-out fight. Carnage versus Venom versus Spider-Man. Ultimately, the Venom symbiote, once Carnage is defeated, Cletus Cassidy's locked up, and, they clean up the remains, the symbiote piece, a symbiote piece from Venom, jumps onto Spider-Man and starts to build up that relationship. At the end of Venom 2, the symbiote completely leaves Eddie and goes to Spider-Man. The post-credit scene would have just seen Peter with the black suit waking up, not knowing where he's at. That iconic scene, right? That's how we end it. In this timeline, there is no Venom 3. There's The Amazing Spider-Man versus Venom. That's your hopeful big billion-dollar ticket. Venom 1 did the same box office numbers. 2 did better than what the second one did because of the Spider-Man factor. 3, they're hoping for $1 billion. This film would essentially be the drag-out fight that people want, to right the wrong that they did with Spider-Man 3. Now, I know this is kind of cheating because it's what if they added Andrew Garfield to the Venom franchise, but you got to understand that if they're adding him, the franchise would swing back around, right? Haha, pun intended, and it would all sort of converge. So in the third film, I think you would have seen Spider-Man after the events of No Way Home again versus Venom after he already visited over there, because that still played out and the symbiote got a taste of what it's like and now it wants even more Spider-Man. So you kind of get a drag-out brawl, right? The Venom symbiote knows of the multiverse. You kind of know what's going on. The only other thing I would bring into this is that by the end of the third film, for both of them, this is where no still plays a factor. So ultimately, however the film plays out, it ends with no escaping the void. And he's not just threatening, to go after them. He wants, again, the entire multiverse. And ultimately, the Venom symbiote becomes the lethal protector, like it always wanted to be, by the influence of Spider-Man, realizing that they both don't want to destroy the universe because the symbiote learned something from Peter, and so did Eddie. And petty revenge and vengeance was never the answer. So then you could continue and make a Spider-Man 4. You can make a Venom 4. You can make a giant crossover that features more characters versus no, but you're kind of left with a franchise that doesn't beat around the bush to trying to confirm Spider-Man exists or doesn't, and he's here or he's there. You kind of just give people what they want, I think, ultimately, and that kind of, I think, would have worked. So there you go. Hopefully you guys enjoyed my take on what if Sony did decide to add Andrew from the very start, or somewhat start, I guess. Up until last year, Marvel TV was not canon to Marvel Studios, and of course, Marvel Entertainment's productions were largely seen as inferior during their entire run. Things like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Daredevil, Iron Fist, Runaways, Cloak and Dagger were not going to be brought into the main canon, but now they of course all are. But what if, right from the start, Marvel Studios and Marvel Entertainment work together? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. So in this hypothetical what-if scenario, we are looking at Marvel Studios and Marvel Entertainment working together like they did in the initial 3 to 4 years when the MCU started. Now, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, back in 2008, when Marvel Studios formed and released Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk with the partnership of Universal, Marvel Studios was just a brand that was connected to Marvel Entertainment. Now, Marvel Entertainment dealt with everything Marvel, more or less. Marvel Comics, the Marvel IP, and Marvel Studios was a sub-studio that went out and got their own funding to make the first phase of films. Now, where things start to fall apart is right around the release of The Avengers. Now, when it comes to branding recognition, I do got to mention that Marvel Entertainment is typically associated with the logo that popped up in front of Marvel films that say in association with Marvel. Again, that's the Marvel Entertainment side of things, and they were always responsible for being co-producers with things like X-Men's Gifted TV series or Legion and every other project that was out there. Now, the initial partnership was pretty decent, and right off the bat in the success of the Avengers, we know that Disney, ABC, and Marvel Studios all greenlit Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. That being a highly successful show, Marvel Entertainment, Marvel Studios, and Disney, with President Bob Iger, would then reveal at a press conference in New York City that the Defenders were coming, and that these characters, which would be produced by ABC and Marvel Entertainment under Disney, would be debuting on Netflix within a couple of years. And he stated in that press release that these characters are going to be appearing in live action films in the future. Now, this is where things start to fall apart for Marvel Entertainment and Marvel Studios relations. So around 2012 to early 2013, Marvel Studios and Marvel Entertainment start butting heads, specifically the people over at Marvel Entertainment, which was based out of New York, versus Marvel Studios, based out of California. Marvel Entertainment decided to take the characters that they had and lock them up in exclusivity contracts and embargo them away from Marvel Studios. And again, these two studios were operating independently under a Disney wing. This caused head of Marvel Studios, Kevin Feige, around the release of Age of Ultron, to threaten to leave the company. And of course, everything then would start to shift, and by 2018, everything under Marvel Entertainment was folded into Marvel Studios. And of course, they were still going to treat some of the projects they had from Marvel's Netflix and TV side as non-canon, which of course changed in the last couple of years. But for this instance, we are going all the way back to 2012-2013. What if that statement that Bob Iger, president of Disney, made ended up being true? And what if there weren't egos at play? And what if everybody got along? So what we're looking at is a rollout of content that's pretty much the same. So for example, every season of Netflix's Daredevil comes out the way it's supposed to. Jessica Jones, everything. But there is a major change due to the fact that Marvel Entertainment was operating with cheap costs, and their people were trying to cut costs every single way that they could. Many of the shows and aspects of their shows ended up being cheap. The difference here would be, working with Marvel Studios, they would want the Marvel quality, or at least it to be on par with something like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or Runaways, which had higher budgets. So in essence, what we end up getting is higher quality content and them acknowledging one another. So for example, when you get to Avengers Endgame and Avengers Infinity War, we know that the Russo brothers back in the day discussed this approach. And they said that they were told, you pretty much can't touch the TV side of things because it's not a factor. We don't really have any say in that. And also, we know that when Marvel Entertainment locked away those rights, there was a grace period where those characters could not be used anywhere at all. So Marvel Studios was even barred from mentioning them, which is why there was never an intended crossover. So if we would have got everything joined together, you would have seen a character like Daredevil guaranteed appear in Avengers Infinity War and or Avengers Endgame. It would have made sense as he was the most popular. But also, think about Marvel Studios having input into those shows and their productions. We could have gotten direct references, crossovers, and even cameos early on. For example, Spider-Man Homecoming taking place in New York. It would have been very easy and very likely that they could have worked Daredevil in there, which would have paid back to Daredevil much earlier than Spider-Man No Way Home. A character like Iron Fist, which Marvel Studios had plans for and wanted to produce a film on, would have actually mattered and been taken care of by people that care about the character and not by the people that just got the character and locked him away. Another prime example being is the use of the Inhumans. Marvel Entertainment stole that after the film announcement, and Marvel Studios was more or less stuck not being able to produce that film, despite them already writing in the Inhumans in terms of how they interconnect to Infinity War and Endgame. So that also would have been a factor. And then, of course, you got to look at some of the other characters. Marvel TV and Marvel Entertainment were trying to lock away characters like Blade and Moon Knight and Ghost Rider, which they succeeded with Ghost Rider. Those characters, with the partnership of Marvel Studios, could have actually mattered and appeared much earlier, as Moon Knight was a character that was being discussed by Marvel Studios all the way back in 2010. And there's even interviews of them talking about continuing to do one-shots and possibly feature Moon Knight in one of those to sort of test the waters. But again, due to Marvel Entertainment's insistence and them producing the one-shots, largely that all fell apart. So a streamlined future that was far more successful and everything integrated would have definitely benefited everybody. But unfortunately, that's not the timeline we live in, and everything was disconnected, and the TV stuff was not canon up until a year and a half ago, where they decided they had to make it canon. Originally starting production in early 2008 with a release date for 2010, George Miller's, aka the director of Mad Max Justice League, would have hit the big screen 2 whole years before we saw the Avengers. How would this have changed entertainment, and would the film have been successful in a time where Batman was going off on his own, being a part of a singular standalone franchise? That's what we're tackling in today's What If video. What if, instead of getting cold feet in 2008, right as production was literally about to begin, WB did not pull the plug on the first day of shooting Justice League Mortal, and the film was allowed to release in 2010. That is going to be the subject that we're tackling here. This, of course, being the one and only Justice League Mortal, which was in pre-production for about a year in Australia. The entire cast was put together, and production was literally ready to go. The night before the production started, we got our first photo as the team was assembled, and well, that next morning, the call came down from WB. The reasoning being is market confusion largely. They figured that since they were working on another attempt at Superman, Chris Nolan had just put out The Dark Knight, that people would be too confused with different Batmen, different Supermen, and at that time, a Flash and a Wonder Woman film were in early development. They figured if it's not the same actor, the audiences would not buy it. So the film had its plug pulled on it after spending reportedly upwards of $60 to $70 million in pre-production and building all the sets, location scouting, and so forth. Now, of course, for those of you doing the math, if this film came out in 2010, it means it would have beat the Avengers to the punch by 2 whole years. And this, of course, is coming after the huge success of The Dark Knight, but before Man of Steel. So in this timeline, for what we're talking about here in the what if scenario, the case that I'm making is The Dark Knight is still allowed to come out, but WB does not get cold feet, and instead they do not proceed with Zack Snyder's version, because why would they? The plan was, by George Miller, to get Justice League out and then produce sequels and or prequels based on the individual characters that people wanted to see more of. So let's go all the way back to 2008. So production starts and it's going. They're not cutting it. After about 6 months, we would have obviously seen the end of production and a deep amount of post-production for a summer blockbuster in 2010, meaning that this film would have been competing with the likes of Captain America the First Avenger and Thor. Now, of course, the MCU was not proven at that time, and both Thor and the First Avenger would end up being flops. The first Captain America movie didn't even make $400 million. The Thor movie, barely over 400. So again, they were flops. But here, you're tailing off the goodwill of The Dark Knight. You are in the middle of the Arkham video game series, just literally hitting its peak, and everybody seemed to have been into Batman. I think that this film, quite honestly, would have made money. Now, I'm not saying it's a guaranteed billion-dollar hit, but I think this film, which had a reported budget of $300 million, would have honestly made close to 850 to 900 million. Because, again, this would have been right there in that prime spot where we're only a couple years removed from Justice League Unlimited ending. People are still very fond of Batman the Animated Series and Superman. There was a whole lot of goodwill for DC at this time, and they were seen as the kings around town because Marvel Studios was still not an it factor. And looking at the film and all the concept art that you guys have seen on the screen, obviously it was different. The Justice League was not the Justice League we know. They played around with different ideas, with different age ranges. They played around with different concepts. Like, for example, there was concept art of Aquaman as a full-on, like, amphibian-looking human hybrid. Then there's more proper approaches, and ultimately we saw that they went a little bit more standard. But there was ideas in place to completely change elements of the DC mythos, which was 100% in the film. So for those that don't know, the film script largely revolved around Justice League Tower of Babel and Superman Sacrifice. Those two were important, and eventually Superman Sacrifice was adapted into an animated film. But Justice League Mortal featured no origin story. Instead, it literally starts with the Justice League being formed years ago, and there was no connection to Brendan Routh's Superman or Christian Bale's Batman or any of that. Instead, we would have seen a more comic book-like approach. Themyscira was very prevalent. Action sequences that were over the top featuring the entire Justice League, including the Justice League fighting, was very prominent in this film. The villains of the film were actually revealed to be Talia al Ghul and Maxwell Lord, who of course ended up being a factor eventually in a Wonder Woman movie. And towards the end of the film, they were setting up a sequel by having Barry Allen die. Now, reportedly, according to some of the reports out there, this was in a way to be able to bring in Wally West, because he's the Flash of that specific time period that more people associate with Flash, and an idea to play with bringing back a evil version of Barry Allen. And you can see how some of these ideas made it into other projects in the DCEU. Now, in this timeline that I'm presenting you with George Miller getting to stick to everything, you got to think about the bigger picture here and the actors they had in play. The idea was to cast lower tier actors that weren't really the most prominent and be able to put them into their own franchises. So Ryan Reynolds' Green Lantern does not happen. Jason Momoa's Aquaman does not happen. Wonder Woman, the way you know it, does not happen. Armie Hammer as Batman would have more than likely spun off after the Dark Knight trilogy. So we're looking at a Man of Steel film where, if we got it, it would have been a spin-off off of Justice League. Flash featuring Wally West would have happened. Aquaman, with a good reception, more than likely would have happened as well. Also, with that Wonder Woman film, which started development in the late 90s and really picked up some steam in the 2000s, would have happened. And you can see how Marvel Studios is slowly trying to build out a future. But by 2012, by the time the Avengers comes out, Justice League is 2 years old. And at that time, they could have already had a Superman film coming that's a sequel to Mortal, a Batman reboot in the works after The Dark Knight Rises, and also a film like Wonder Woman to really beat everybody to the punch. So there was a lot in motion that I think could have worked for WB had they not gotten cold feet. But also, you got to think about the reasoning that WB had. And while I'm not defending them, I get it. They saw what Marvel was doing and what they announced, and they looked at the market and saw that people were literally confused as to why is the new Superman on film not the kid from the TV series. The market was different. The audiences were still not as smart as they are today, and some audiences aren't even as smart today. And also some very radical designs and changes that are a huge departure from what people expected because they gave George Miller free reins. Again, it's a different time. But you got to think about how he stuck a landing with Mad Max. And again, while that film is not really the biggest success, and I think Fury Road is great, George Miller, I don't think is the right director for this concept, and I think they understood that. Would I have loved to see this? Yes. Is it one of the greatest, unfortunately never made mysteries in the history of comic book films? Yes. But sadly, we'll never know what could have been, and ultimately what we have is about 24 images and concept arts, and that's about it. And that's all we got to go by. So what we ended up getting instead, well, we know how that went. So who knows if this would have been better or worse. Where we sit right now, we know that Iron Man is one of the most important films in all of Marvel's history. But what if that first film came out, and what if it bombed just like The Incredible Hulk? How would Marvel Studios have survived? Would they have survived? And what would be of Marvel Studios today? That's exactly what we're looking at in this video. Before you get upset, I know Iron Man was a success. Obviously, it set the foundation for the entire future of the MCU. This is a what-if scenario. What would have happened to the MCU and the Iron Man franchise had Iron Man 1 bombed? This is a hypothetical. Don't get upset at a hypothetical. I don't know how much more I can stress this in these what-if videos. Okay, so the story for this what-if hypothetical takes us all the way back to 2005. The first time Marvel Studios really had any sort of presence at a Comic-Con, and they announced that Iron Man would be a film with a very crude poster that was sort of just like the cover of an Iron Man comic. Now, despite this announcement, Marvel Studios was not really in a position to even guarantee that this was going to happen, as the then co-head and very early in his career head of Marvel Studios, Kevin Feige, was out there building a independent studio. And a lot of people don't realize this, but Marvel Studios was a indie studio. What they had to do was get funding. And the head of Marvel Studios, Kevin Feige, went from studio to studio. He went to WB. He went to Sony. He went to Disney, Paramount, Universal. Everybody told him no. So what he instead had to do was take out loans against all these films. And essentially, Marvel and their entire future and everything was on the line. And they were given a grant of $500 million to produce all of Phase 1. So we're talking about Iron Man 1, 2, Incredible Hulk, which was a co-production. So that was essentially free because they let Universal hang on to the rights as long as Marvel Studios could oversee that the film was in the MCU. And then you got like Thor and Captain America, and at that time WB was in talks to buy Captain America outright and produce his films, while Thor was meandering between Sony and Universal wanting a crack at him. Iron Man was also at Universal, but Avi Arad was able to lock in a deal to bring him fully to Marvel Studios. So with the money locked in, Marvel started production, and production on Iron Man 1 was hard. There was an incomplete script. Only about 30% of the script was written. Every deadline, they were way past. They were using some extra money from some of the other projects that they were hoping to make in order to fund more Iron Man, just because things were not falling into place. It was a very ragtag, scrappy production. And what happens is Iron Man comes out in 2008, makes bank. And at the same time, they got lucky with this one because The Incredible Hulk needed more post-production. And due to a fallout with Edward Norton not wanting to advertise the film, The Incredible Hulk was delayed after Iron Man, but it was supposed to come out before because everybody, including Marvel Studios and all analysts, were banking on The Incredible Hulk being a hit. Now, of course, in hindsight, we know this didn't happen. The Incredible Hulk is a giant failure, and Iron Man was a huge success, making well over $600 million off of a very cheap budget. So Marvel would go on, start production on Iron Man 2, and well, Disney saw this and said, you know what? Let's just buy all of Marvel and we'll take care of all the budgets. But what if Iron Man 1 releases in 2008, and not only is The Incredible Hulk a bomb, what if Iron Man barely makes a profit or doesn't at all? Let's say $250 million instead of its $600 plus million. What happens to Iron Man and Marvel Studios? And the truth is, and some of you are going to want an elaborate answer, but there is no elaborate answer. Marvel is dead. That's what happens. Marvel's stock was really low, and we're talking about low stock. And just a couple years prior to Iron Man, their stock was almost worthless. They were struggling, constantly selling off rights and IPs and characters just to stay afloat for literally sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars per character just to stay afloat. Marvel had everything bet on Iron Man and The Incredible Hulk. The reality of it is, if Iron Man 1 comes out and bombs, Iron Man 2 does not happen. The Incredible Hulk bombs, it never got a sequel. What would have happened is that Marvel's future and debt would have essentially been given back. All that money that they got would have been given back. Everything that Marvel has would have been taken and auctioned off to the nearest bidder to cover everything. And Marvel as a whole would cease to exist. Like, we are talking no Marvel. No Marvel comics the way they are today and the way they recovered. Everything would have been piecemealed and sold off. I think it's safe to say that Robert Downey Jr.'s career would not be where it is, and he definitely would have fallen off from Hollywood because nobody would have wanted to hire him. Edward Norton, he'd pretty much be in the same place. Actors like Chris Evans, after Fantastic Four, people did not want to hire him. Marvel gave him a chance because of how cheap they locked him in. Actors like Chris Hemsworth would largely be unknown because, again, Thor made him. Captain America made Chris Evans. Iron Man made Robert Downey Jr. You know, it's these characters and their box office that made them. It's not the old way where the actors made the character. That changed right around this time. And also, the competition from other franchises would have severely hurt Marvel getting any other film out the way. Transformers was peaking. You had The Dark Knight. DC, at the time, was working on more films and were seen as the superior brand. Like, there was just no recovery for Marvel Studios at all had Iron Man failed. The Avengers would never have happened. Marvel TV never would have happened. And essentially, Fox would have inherited, I think, more of the characters, continue doing what they're doing. Hollywood would be different and more consolidated now than they are. And the entertainment industry as a whole would not have seen year-over-year growth for a decade without Marvel Studios. So that's the what if Iron Man failed scenario. Before canceling all plans to continue the Amazing Spider-Man universe, Sony announced release dates for The Amazing Spider-Man 3, The Amazing Spider-Man 4, a Venom film was in development, Sinister Six had a release date, and 2 more spin-off films were coming at us. So in this video, we're going to look at what could have happened if Sony decided to stick with their plans and not join the MCU. So in this episode of What If, we are looking at the potential of Sony releasing the announced The Amazing Spider-Man 3, The Amazing Spider-Man 4, Venom, and the Sinister Six film, along with another couple projects that they had in the works. So, for all intents and purposes, what we're working with here is that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 comes out the way that it does, still releasing in May of 2014, and the film still makes the exact amount of money it made. For those that don't remember, it made $717 million. A success by any metric, but the budget of the film was $300 million, so it made a small profit. The problem here is that the critics ripped the film apart. Fans also did not like it, and well, Sony had to listen to that response and the overwhelming understanding, knowing that the next few films were also going to each cost 300-ish million, but chances are that they weren't going to deliver the same box office return, which is why they joined Marvel Studios. But let's just say that Sony decided to stick with it. And instead of abandoning everything, they move forth. So the original date for The Amazing Spider-Man 3 was June 10th of 2016. Now, of course, a couple other films came out in close proximity, aka Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice and Captain America: Civil War. Obviously, this would have released in June, aka a month after Civil War, so Civil War has to play out differently. Let's obviously agree with that. And at the same time, them releasing on June 2nd would have been competition with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Out of the Shadows. Now, this, of course, was a film that ended up ending that franchise for better or for worse, but there was also other competition like the Warcraft film, which actually ended up making a sizable amount of money, Finding Dory, which was a success, and a couple other films later on in that month. But let's say this film does come out on June 2nd would have been international, but June 10th in the United States. Obviously, there's a lot to unpack about the film, right? We know that it would have followed up on the events of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. The Rhino was expected and confirmed to return for the third film. On top of this, the Sinister Six would have factored into it. We just don't know to what extent. What else is interesting is that the following year, in 2017, we were going to see the release of the Sinister Six film, picking up after the events of The Amazing Spider-Man 3. But the other interesting factor here is that The Amazing Spider-Man 4 set its date on May 4th of 2018. Yes, this would have been in direct competition with Avengers: Infinity War, Solo: A Star Wars Story, and Deadpool 2. And you guys know that those two films cannibalized one another, so The Amazing Spider-Man 4 would 100% have moved. My guess is move it back to June of 2018. But before we get there, we got to go back to TASM 3. The box office would have naturally been down. I'm guessing that the third film would have seen about $600-ish million, especially due to, again, stiff competition and Marvel Studios already, becoming the Marvel Studios ultimate juggernaut that they were around the time Civil War released. But also, you got to look at the rest of the competition. The Amazing Spider-Man 4, I fear, would have suffered the same exact. Unless they completely fixed up the scripts and, issues people had, which it doesn't sound like they wanted to up until they were in desperation mode, that film probably would have made 500 to 600 million. And what I'm doing here is applying pretty much the same downward trajectory that Sony had with Venom. That's how I'm coming up with these numbers. Now, the Sinister Six, I think, would have been interesting because that was a direct response to what was happening with the Guardians of the Galaxy and Suicide Squad. My guess is that would have been the lowest earning of these films, coming in with around 450, maybe 500 max. And ultimately, the end goal and the big one that they were pushing for was a Venom film for 2017. Now, whether or not this made it out, and there was a TASM film every year or a TASM Universe film, who knows? But let's just say that Venom does come out. Venom starring Tom Hardy, released on October 5th of 2018. For this, we're saying 2017, because 2018 would have seen The Amazing Spider-Man versus Venom. That was their whole intent, to make a standalone Venom film that picks up after TASM 3 and Sinister 6, and then the ultimate crossover. My guess is that this would not have helped that much. Yes, there would have been help, but the sheer power of Infinity War doing what it did, and that being one of the biggest blockbuster years, I'm going to guess that Sony would have delayed The Amazing Spider-Man 3 as a contingency into way later. Possibly into when Venom came out, so 2018. I think had they delayed it, we could have seen more success. $1 billion hit, I think, would be guaranteed at that point because, one, it's Spider-Man, and it's, again, him versus Venom. So let's just say Tom Hardy stayed as Venom. The Amazing Spider-Man 4 is that crossover. I mean, because we got to move the timeline around, I think that they would have found success. But I think it would have been short-lived, as Sony then would continue to produce more TASM and Venom films. The interest would naturally start to go down. And in the end, everything ends, I think, the same way it does. Because Sony then would have seen, well, Venom is a success. Spider-Man, it continues to go down, but we stick through with it. The other films they would have announced would have definitely happened. So you're looking at the likes of the Jackpot film, which they announced in 2018, a follow-up to Sinister 6, and another film like Madam Web, which they were in development of, which would have focused on her being younger, would have all happened. And on top of this, I think you would have seen Spider-Man also face Kraven at some point, possibly in a sequel. You would have seen more of a effort to bring in some other characters like Morbius much earlier. And what you get in the end is a universe that constantly releases one after the other with diminishing returns and not fixing any errors because Sony didn't want to listen to what the fans wanted till they were desperate. I think ultimately Spider-Man would have ended up in the MCU just much later. We'd be talking about Spider-Man joining the MCU right now instead of when we were in 2016. And in the finale of this year's What If, we are looking at the Crisis Week effect that could have changed everything. What if Sony did in fact agree to buy all of the rights to all Marvel characters in live action and cartoons right then and there when they decided to only buy Spider-Man? Let's talk about how different entertainment would be today. In the finale of this year's Crisis Week, we are tackling one of the biggest what-ifs ever. As in 1998, Sony had the chance to buy almost every Marvel character for $25 million. They chose to only pick up Spider-Man for $7 million, and they stated, and I quote, "Nobody gives a damn about the other Marvel characters," end quote. Now, just to clarify what characters were a part of this and which ones were not, everything MCU would have been a part of this. The characters that are exempt are very few and far in between. The ones that are exempt are the X-Men, as they were locked away to Fox in 1993. This also means Sony would have gained the rights to Blade, even though the first film was coming out from New Line Cinema, which was at that time just a licensing partnership with Marvel. And Namor would have still been in an interesting place with his character rights, but again, that all eventually would revert. A character like the Hulk is also off limits as he was acquired by Universal. So with that out of the way, let's get into what I think would have happened. So you're looking at a giant roster of characters, and Sony largely wants to focus on Spider-Man because that's the big one. So in this timeline, what we're looking at is Sony pushing through with Spider-Man 1 and seeing the success of that film along with Fox putting out X-Men 1 and X-Men 2. and then also finding success with the Fantastic Four in early development, Sony would have seen that there is a possibility to be more, I want to say, confident with the Marvel brand as they're hitting a couple of home runs and even smaller hits like Daredevil. And of course, Blade was already taking off. So Blade would have continued to happen. I think it just would have been a partnership. But what we're looking at here is Sony looking at the big portfolio that they got. So, for example, Marvel was trying for quite a bit of time to get Captain America off the ground. I think under Sony, you would have seen Captain America happen. Now, also at this time, they would have been looking at bigger actors for these roles, and I think Captain America would have more than likely landed some big name actor to try to boost the character's popularity. It's not like Spider-Man, where Tobey Maguire was largely unknown. This is something that you're not sure of. It's not a recognizable character by many. So this would have been the one that, to me, it goes in a completely different direction. The other one was Thor. Thor bounced around from studio to studio, and at one point, even Sam Raimi was trying to make a Thor film for Sony. I think Thor would have happened, and again, another big name would have circulated this role. I remember way back when this project was in the early rumor stages and bouncing from studio to studio, that Brad Pitt was attached at some point, or at least rumored, to be in talks. Now, how far that got, who knows? But again, I think that would have been something that does happen. So by 2005, 2006, we're looking at 2 Spider-Man films are officially out. We're looking at a Captain America and a Thor film. We're looking at Universal putting out Hulk and that doing what it does. And I think that this would have been something that also reverts to Sony, because Universal would have kind of been stuck with it and they would have more or less run out of time. Marvel, being the intermediate between the two, would have, I think, negotiated a deal. So I think you still get an Incredible Hulk, but that's co-produced by Sony. Maybe a loose sequel, because they were working on an Ang Lee sequel before that fell through. So maybe that could have been something that happens. Now, the more interesting factor here for me is, what about some of the other characters? Because Sony had locked in Ghost Rider. I think Ghost Rider would have also happened the way it does, but I think Sony would have pushed for more connective tissue. Because you got to remember, even at this time, Marvel Studios' Kevin Feige was still climbing his way up and a low-level man at these positions. I think he would have been able to convince them to kind of connect a couple of dots and start dropping in a few Easter eggs, references, and maybe even direct cameos. And I think you would have seen, ultimately, the Avengers project. And I think this would have come off the back of Sony seeing that Justice League Mortal was coming from WB. Realizing that if they're going to produce this and start shooting in early 2008, we can beat them by 2008 or 2009. I think you would have seen a pseudo-Avengers style film. It would have been Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man. It would have been whoever is Captain America. It would have been Brad Pitt's Thor. You would have gotten some version of the Hulk. I think they would have tossed like a Ghost Rider in there. And it would be a very loose adaptation of the whole Avengers project. Now, the one thing that I haven't talked about yet that I think is important is, also at this time, Marvel was developing a Black Widow project with Solid Snake himself, David Hayter. I think with the good relationship that Sony had with their video game division at one time, and David Hayter being a name, I think that Black Widow film would have happened. Now, whether it was standalone under Sony or something completely different, I don't know. But I think that would have happened as well. And if it connects to the Avengers and their Spider-Man universe, who really knows? But the fact of the matter is, Sony would not have seen the light at the end of the tunnel like Kevin Feige did. Because after all, in this timeline, Marvel Studios and Kevin Feige never end up ascending, and Avi Arad still ends up producing everything. And ultimately, what you're getting is Avi and his hubris on top of Ike Perlmutter still running Marvel Comics. And those egos would have clashed harder than any egos we've seen between Avi, between Kevin, and between Perlmutter. It would have been far worse. Budgets would have been slashed. The whole action figure department and comic side would have been botched because Perlmutter was not in the business of advertising films he was not profiting from, which is what Sony was doing. The fundamental landscape of all of Marvel would be completely different. And right now, we would be sitting in pretty much Spider-Man only, maybe. Because I don't think under them, the other films would have succeeded. Because they didn't know how to market them, and they never would have had an interest. So that is how things would have played out if Sony bought all the rights to most of Marvel in 1998. Thank you for checking out that video, and thank you for your continued support. Feel free to like, share, subscribe, do whatever you will, and if you're so inclined and would like some additional content from us, which includes unfiltered content and bonus discussions, we do offer exclusively in our member section. We hope to see you there. So thank you for watching, and have a good one.